This set of slides is actually going to be in two parts, and it has a couple of different headings to it. One would be the emergence of art photography in the mid to late 1800s, and another one might be an examination of pictorialism and naturalism. And there will be two names, two important names, as well as a host of other influences and influence bys. And the two names that you're going to hear about are Robinson and Emerson. And we'll figure this out as we go along. So prior to art photography, we had the invention of photography, and we called that period of time 1820 to 1840. We called that early experiments. And that was quickly followed by portraits for the masses and armchair travel photography. And both of those were commercial applications of photography. It was important for photography to advance technologically. And if you had just invented photography, you probably wouldn't go out and say, okay, the first thing I want to do is make art from it, because there just wasn't the opportunity to make money. When they said the first thing we want to do is make portraits for the masses, all of a sudden you had many inventors who were looking at the cumbersome process, and these inventors were making advances in lenses, they were making advances in cameras, and they had pushed photography forward so that, a few years later, after the fad of portraiture and armchair travel, after that fad kind of worked through, you had a better camera, you had better plates, and now you could have artists who would learn the process of photography. Now, I would like to point out that even today, if you look at all of photography as a pie chart, and you have art photography as one little tiny slice of the pie, because it really is, maybe 1% or 2% of all the photography activity today is in the realm of art photography. There's so many other applications. But we are in an art humanities class, and we want to talk about how the photograph was used in many ways, but of course we want to look at art photography too. So before those names, Robinson and Emerson, there was a fellow by the name of Reiklander. And Reiklander is a trained studio artist. And Reiklander is interested in the latest technology, and he does learn how to use the camera to take pictures. Now, if you're trained in setting up models, making sure that the models have authentic props, making sure your models have authentic costumes. If you're trained as an artist to set up a subject so that you can paint it, it would follow, logically, it would follow that the artist would then use the same sort of an attitude, but instead of using a paintbrush and canvas to record what he's looking at or she's looking at, they would instead wheel in a big studio camera and try and record the setup in front of them. Now, what does Victorian painting look like? What are some of the attributes of Victorian painting? And when we say Victorian, all of the people that I'm talking about in this presentation are English, United Kingdom, and Queen Victoria was on the throne. So we call this the Victorian Empire, is what it turned into. Well, painters were trying to recreate some kind of romantic, kind of middle-agey, kind of mythical paintings, and you'll hear the term allegory used to describe some of these paintings. And the title of this, I don't know the title of this one, sorry, but it could very well be taken from a myth, like a Greek myth, and the Victorian artists like to look backwards and think about these old times. If you were a wealthy young couple and you had just been married, instead of grabbing a hold of the phone and calling up the portrait photographer, couldn't do that, no phones and no traveling portrait photographers. What you did instead was you brought in a painter, and the painter posed you and would paint your pictures. So the art photographers, when they are setting up their people pictures, they're going to borrow from the conventions of the painter in setting up their pictures. If you've read Charles Dickens, you know that the Victorian time period was not pleasant for everybody. London was a rough town. There were many, many poor people, and life on the street was really hard for them. So I guess today we would call it social documentary photography, but back then some of the Victorian painters had a sense of moral courage, and they wanted to picture what was wrong with their country as well as what was right with their country. So this is kind of like a teaching painting. Victorian artwork, you could say it was kind of like going to church and hearing a sermon, or going to a lecture and hearing somebody talking about problems in the country. And at the end of every sermon, or at the end of every talk, there was a moral attached to it. And it would be, in this case, it might be, don't overlook the poverty in our city. Look at the pain and look at the suffering that is happening. So let's get back to photography. And here we have a picture that was done by Reiklander, and it was called The Two Ways of Life. this painting was, or this photograph was actually what we call a combination or a composite print. One would think that Reiklander went out and hired a whole bunch of models, and one would think that he just set up a huge stage with all of the people in certain poses, etc., etc. Well, it didn't work that way. This picture, you'll have to read about it in the textbook, is actually 5 or 6, I'm not sure exactly how many, different captures. And then what Reiklander would do would be to take these different negatives into the darkroom and use a pin registration to line everything up just right, and he would blend the pictures together. So when you are looking at this type of early art photography, one thing to do is kind of look for these dark areas, okay? And that's usually where the seams, that's usually where the blends would be taking place. Wherever you see a dark area, then you would have maybe one grouping over here that was taken. So you'd have like pieces of a puzzle that are printed together. And by doing this, you could make a fairly good size piece, maybe 3 feet wide. And in a sense, that was like going to an art museum and looking at a painting that was 2 or 3 feet wide. So lots of morality in this picture. You have a philosopher, you have a bard, you have a person of wisdom, and then you have youth number 1, and then you have youth number 2, and the bard is bringing these 2 young men into the world, and the bard is saying, look over here, this is one of your options. Kind of looks like a fraternity party. And he's also saying, look over here, and this is another one of your options. So on this side of the picture, we have all of the vices, okay? All the vices. And on this side of the picture over here, we have all the virtues. And even though youth number 1 is being tempted to follow all of the vices, the kind old sage is warning them that maybe down here you have one of the sinners looking for forgiveness from somebody who looks very saintly over here. And all these people on the side, these are all industrious. There's a carpenter who's working with wood. There's people who are reading the Bible to better themselves. And this is a very teaching, a very moral kind of photograph. I do want you to understand that new art is sometimes influenced by old art. And in this case, I want you to remember, as I change the slide, I want you to remember this archway here, okay? This is a framing device. I want you to remember that there are central figures in the picture. Okay, so here we have a picture by Raphael, and it's called The School of Athens, and it was done 300 years before Reichlander decided to do his picture. But we have the same layout. We have the same kind of arch here. We have very important figures in the archway, and then we have groupings of figures. These are not partiers, by the way. Every one of these pictures, every one of these people are all virtuous people. And you have homage to classical figures and artists in this picture by Raphael. So Reichlander had borrowed a look from an earlier piece of artwork and just brought it into his particular moment of time. This is a setup shot, okay? One of the things that Reichlander would do would be to hire models and make sure that they were wearing the right kinds of things. And they would bring in, just like a drama department has a prop department, they would, Reichlander would have a prop department, and he'd bring in a table and a tablecloth and chairs and hang up some sort of a drapery. So this is called that was called lost pen and spectacles. Now, painters in the wider community of the arts were scared of people who use cameras to make pictures. And I referred to this in the overview, and I said that a person with a paintbrush felt like they had a God-given talent to make images. And when they saw a camera making images, it kind of chilled them out a little bit, and they got kind of afraid. So they mounted a campaign, and they said, you cannot make art that moves people's emotions in any way except by an artist with a paintbrush who processes through their mind, and then they use their hand to paint or to draw. And they said a camera is a wonderful gizmo or gadget, but it's just a scientific optical device. Artwork needs to move people's souls, and a camera can't do that. That was the claim of the art community at the time, and because of that, they would close the art museum as a venue to show photographs. You could not do that because you'd have to go down to the Science Museum to look at photographs. So here you have the struggling artist working away in their studio and making real art, and the camera could not make real art. So Reichlander gets old and tired and decides to kind of drop out of photography, but he's made a name for himself. And oh, by the way, Reichlander was not originally from England, but he did work in England. And then an English fellow by the name of Robinson steps up and says, "No worry, I will take over art photography." And I told you there were going to be two names, two big names, Robinson and Emerson. And if you were to say, well, which one came first? The answer is Robinson. But Emerson was not long after, and Robinson and Emerson kind of had a bunch of followers. Each one of them had a bunch of followers, and there was this polarization in the early photographic art community. You were either following Robinson, who was following Reichländer, but Robinson wrote a book, and the pictorial effect in photography became a Bible for a bunch of educated hobbyists who wanted to learn all of the tricks of the trade. And you're going to get to look in your assignment, and you're going to get to take a look at a document that I made up one summer when I was reading from this book. So you're going to hear the exact words of Robinson talking to his followers and telling them all of the secrets of how he makes his pictures. And many of those secrets are still being taught today if you go to take a job at a portrait studio like at Target or Sears or anything in the mall. They're going to teach you to pose people and light people. They're going to say, we're using modern equipment, but you can trace this all back to Robinson's studio photography. So the first part of art photography has a confusing title, pictorial. And you're going to run into three different meanings of pictorialism. So when you have the context of the time period and somebody says pictorial photography in the Victorian age, you think of Robinson. Sometimes it's called high art photography. So what are the three meanings of pictorialism? We just talked about the first one. It was kind of like studio-based photography, and Robinson followed in the footsteps of Reichländer, and he had props and he had costumes and he had models, and he would do composite printing and blend things together. Now there's a second phase at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 20th century, where pictorialism was practiced by some of the friends of Alfred Stieglitz. And the nickname pictorial and soft focus kind of goes together. It was a dreamy type of picture. And then the third one, in our contemporary, as people are learning photography today, and somebody says the show is all about pictorial photography, think of picture postcards. Really nice pictures, okay? They're pretty pictures. They're not pictures that have a philosophical axe to grind. They're not edgy. They're enjoyable kinds of pictures. So in our unit that we're working on right now, it's about Robinson, it's about high art photography, and I just want to make sure that you understand a little later, or if you go online and you start Googling pictorial, you may end up in any one of these three categories, which can make things confusing. Well, let's go to a masterpiece. This is called Fading Away, and it was taken in the middle of the 1800s, a little bit late, and I have to put it in context. This is England. Um, during the 1800s, waves of diseases would travel across Europe and jump the English Channel, and then they would travel across the United Kingdom. And the pandemic that we're in now is very similar to what these people felt like. They felt like there should be a cure, there ought to be a cure. And certain diseases, once they grabbed a hold of an individual, they were more or less terminal. They were not going to come back from the disease. So when this picture was taken, that's the context. England was having, I'm not sure whether it was cholera or whether it was malaria or whether it was a type of flu that didn't have, we didn't have any vaccines at this time period. People just got sick and many of them would die. So when England was going through this, Robinson decided to make this picture that he felt had artistic merit to it. He felt like he was kind of responding to the times, and he felt that this picture might pull on somebody's heartstrings, because here the main character is a young lady with supposedly many wonderful years ahead of her, and she's been struck down with this illness. And maybe that's her sister on the right, and maybe that's her mother on the left with a Bible. And the person at the window, people think about that as maybe a doctor or clergyman. And he's got his back turned because he's understands that he's letting these people down, that he can't do anything to reverse this illness. So Robinson was kind of making what he thought was something that everybody could sympathize with. Now, when he showed this picture, the art critics and the art community got really mad at Robinson, and they said, "Shame on you. We are suffering. We are hurting. And you have made a piece of art that makes us feel terrible." Now, if you were Robinson, you maybe not want to hear that coming from your art critic friends, but at the same time, I think Robinson realized that he had just proven a fact, and that was that the camera could communicate to people's emotions. It was not a cold optical instrument. It could make art, not just scientific types of pictures. And I think that gave him cause to go on with his art photography and attempt to get it into museums. And in the first photo show wasn't until the very early 1900s. So it was kind of an uphill battle to go. So here's some of the philosophy. Guys, you signed up for the class, and some of you are working photographers, and you signed up for the class to learn about these different schools of photography or the different philosophies of photographers. So I want to tell you right now that this particular emphasis on Robinson and Emerson, you could say in today's world of photography, Robinson represents the studio photographers and Emerson represents the street photographers or the news photographers. So we're having groups of people reading books and getting a feeling like, well, pictorialism is something that I like and I can identify with, and I want to be a pictorial photographer. I want you to take this test right now if you've ever worked with a camera. Have you ever arranged the people in a picture in front of you? Have you ever set the camera down before taking the picture and walking into the picture and pick something up and move it from one place to another, or take it out of the picture and then you went back to the camera and you shot your picture? Okay, if you're doing that, in a sense, you're inheriting pictorial effect in photography. You're doing the same type of thing that was done in Robinson's Pictorialism. Studio photography is all about that. You know, you go into a studio, they've already told you what kind of clothes to wear. They choose what kind of a backdrop. They put the props in the picture for you. That is the photographer is behind the camera sometimes, and then they come out and maybe they adjust a person's tie, or maybe they adjust the way the hair is falling on the sitter, and then they go back behind the camera. So if you're finding yourself in front of the camera, behind the camera, and you're making pictures, that is called pictorial photography. Nowadays we call it studio. All right, so it's very theatrical. We can use studio, we can use a stage, we can use costumes, and the most important thing is that it has to look real. And Robinson was very clear about that. And he said, you'll read this in the quote sheet that's attached to the assignment. He said it would be possible for a photographer to print a picture of a flying horse. You could do that. You could take a horse and you could take wings from a bird and you could print the horse with wings on it. And Robinson said, no, no, never, never do that. Because if you're doing that, you're showing people that the camera can lie. Now, were his pictures the truth, like Fading Away? Was that lady sick? No, that lady wasn't sick. Was that a room in a hospice? Were those her actual relatives? No, they were all hired to stand in. But the most important thing is the picture has to look real, and Robinson was adamant about that. Robinson was a pretty darn good sketch artist on his own. You'll notice that's a workup for one of his pictures. So guys, even today, if you walk into a commercial shoot, the photographer might get out a big envelope and pull sketches out of it from some commercial artist who is working on a advertising campaign, and the advertising committee, the brainstorm people, said, why don't we do a coffee ad, and we're going to have a coffee cup here, and we're going to have a person seated over there. And so when they go to do the shoot, the sketches come out. And this is a guide to how to, for the photographer, how to compose the picture. So Robinson did this on his own. So he envisioned the picture, and then he would probably shoot the couple, the two people walking. He'd probably shoot that in his studio and then blend that into a background picture that he took outside. But it looks real. So Robinson was earlier than Emerson. And what you're going to find out here is that he was working with slower films. And when he worked with slower films, he couldn't take advantage, he couldn't work with electrical lights, and he couldn't work outside. So that was what made doing pictures in pieces significant to him. So here is a study. This is one of the pieces of Fading Away, which you can see is kind of blended into this picture right here. He did not shy away from the painted backdrop. This would be something that if you went to opera, if you went to theater in Victorian England, you would see painted backdrops and other natural looking things so that when you stood your subject up in front of it in your studio, it looked like you were outside. And here's an example. Probably the foreground and the people. Okay, that was one negative here, and then the background was a painted backdrop behind them. So composite printing. As the other Victorian painters could paint the old days, subject matter could be lofty, and subject matter, many of the pictorial artists said, I like King Arthur's stories. And this was a time that was called the pre-Raphaelite era in British painting. So it was kind of going back towards the Middle Ages. Here is a Robinson picture of Guinevere, and she is one of the characters in King Arthur Fables. So don't worry, it's not the real Guinevere. This picture was not taken in 1379. This picture was made to look like the old days. Um, One of the things they got from early experiments was that a good photograph should be sharp and clear and in focus. So most of these were um, sharp focus photographs. And in order for them to be considered the highest form of craftsmanship, they wanted to have a sharp focus. Here's an allegory, dawn and sunset. You have the grandparent or great-grandparent seated by the fire, and you also have the young mother with the newborn. So this is the kind of thing that got pictorial photography in trouble with the 20th century. Art photographers in the 20th century started to look down their nose at pictorialists because they said it was too sentimental and it was too sweet and it did not reflect the world as the world is. And I've got to tell you that I was raised in photography and I was taught to have that attitude, to look on these pictures and say, oh, it's just syrupy sweet and it can't be art. It's just so dated and it looks so old. After being in photography for my whole life and looking at some of these pictures now, I just am very impressed with the way that these photographers overcame obstacles. And I don't look down my nose at these pictures. I think to myself, they're a reflection of the time. And I try to put my 21st century glasses away, and I try and pick up my perspective, my Victorian era perspective glasses, and put them on and appreciate how these pictures painstakingly, some of them coming out of sketches and being composed piece by piece and then blended in the darkroom. I'm kind of in awe of that. This was way before Photoshop, way before digital manipulation, and they were figuring out something similar to that. So we're going to stop here at the end of Robinson, and in part 2, we're going to talk about a response. We're going to talk about action and reaction. And Robinson is the action, and Emerson is going to be the reaction. So stay tuned.